Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this really terrific event that I'm happy to get started. Thank you for tuning in to talk with us about knowing your price, a conversation about valuing Black lives and property with a Brookings Fellow and author, Dr. Andre Perry. My name is Libby Wentz. I'm the Vice Provost and Dean of the Graduate College here at ASU, and we're thrilled to have Dr. Perry join us today to talk about his book. Before we move on to that, I want to urge you to join us also for the Graduate College Distinguished Lecture, which is going to take place on Thursday, October 21st, when Dr. Perry will actually be coming here on campus in person to speak with us about canceling debt and the issue of, which is of course an issue of intense national debate that has the potential to affect generations of college students and their families. We will share the link to register for the event, which is going to be in person as well as available online following today's discussion. But right now I want to turn our attention to the work that our moderator is going to take place for today's event. Dr. Mako Fitts Ward. She is an assistant professor of African American and Women and Gender Studies in the School of Social Transformation at ASU. Dr. Fitts Ward brings over 18 years of experience to teaching core principles of justice and social change to college students and really advocating in communities around the country. She's the director of the Social Transformation Lab, a project here out of the Office of the President, where the ASU faculty partner with organizations to co-create pedagogical tools and inclusive offerings that reimagine equitable, intersectional, and sustainable systems to deepen personal belonging and end the legacies of exclusion and harm. She's also the co-editor of a reader called The Pandemic Reader, Exposing Social Justice in the Time of COVID. And I'm really excited to have her here with us to help moderate this discussion. So Mako, I'm going to pass the mic to you and have you introduce our special guest. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Dean Wentz. It's my honor to be here today to moderate our discussion. And before we begin, I'd like to just take a brief moment to inform our viewers that we will be addressing questions that were submitted by our registrants through their registration process, and also taking questions live from the audience using the Q&A function. We'll address as many questions as we can during the event, but we may not be able to get to all of them. So we ask that you refrain from submitting your questions until after Dr. Perry has finished completing his presentation, and then we'll begin the discussion. So it's my pleasure to formally introduce our featured speaker for today's event. Dr. Andre Perry is a noted educator, journalist, and scholar, and currently serves as senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a private nonprofit organization devoted to research, education, and publication on important issues of domestic and foreign policy. With a background in education policy and leadership, he is nationally known and respected for his important social impact research on race, class, and gender, the intersections of these social locations, and understanding structural inequalities related to housing, education, urban development, and economic inclusion. He is the author of the groundbreaking book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities, which will be the primary focus for today's conversation. Prior to Brookings, Dr. Perry worked in education in the Louisiana government. He is the founder of the College of Urban Education at Davenport University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and was an associate professor of educational leadership at the University of New Orleans. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Perry to Arizona State University.
Hello, and thank you, Dr. Ward and Dean Wentz, for allowing me to interact with your faculty and tee people up for a much deeper conversation in person in a few days, not a few days, but soon enough. I'm actually going to get started right away because a lot of how I'm going to introduce myself is embedded in my presentation. So I'm going to share that with you all. Let's see. Share. Hold on. I think Oh, hold on 1 second. There we go. Hopefully you can all see my screen. Just let me know if you do not. Again, a lot of this you can find in my book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities, available wherever fine books are sold. At the Brookings Institution, I study Black majority cities and neighborhoods, and specifically, I look at the assets within them. Clearly, there are too many Black majority neighborhoods to put on a map, but here is a map of the Black majority cities where the share of the Black population is 50% or higher. And again, I specifically look at the homes, the businesses, the infrastructure to get a sense of how much they are worth and valued in these spaces. One of those dots in there is Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. And this is where I grew up in Wilkinsburg. This is 1320 Hill Avenue. Wilkinsburg is a small Black majority municipality surrounded by Pittsburgh on 3 sides. And as you can see here, it's boarded up, it's been abandoned, it's worth a few $1,000s, but the home is worth so much more to me. You see that woman in the upper right-hand corner? Her name is Elsie Boyd. I call her Mom. Well, Mom, as the story was told to me, Mom and my maternal grandmother made a deal where it was agreed upon that she would take me in when I was born, largely because my mother was young and poor, impoverished. She was 17 when she had me. She was 15 when she had my older brother. And she was probably abused. And so Mom did what a lot of Black matriarchs did in communities. She took in kids. And you know, although there was a lot of personal strife in my life at the time, there was also social, political, and economic strife in the city overall in the region. U.S. Steel was pulling out. There was a lot of poverty, unemployment. Unemployment in general was 20%, which means it was significantly higher for Black people. And so again, Mom did what a lot of matriarchs did. She took in kids. I stayed from birth to when I graduated from high school, but she took in kids for varying durations during that time. As you can see here, there were lots of kids, Black kids, white kids, multiracial kids, where she took in. Some would stay a few weeks, some would stay months. Myself and some of my other siblings stay until we graduated from high school. One of the reasons why this gentleman here, this man here right here was my father. His name is Floyd Criswell. He was a heroin addict. He was in and out of prison. He was probably abusive to my mother, but his addiction landed him in prison. And as I was told all my life, I was told that his choices it ended up putting him in jail, ended up leading to his incarceration. Well, I wanted to study why, for my book, what were the socio-political and environmental environment or the surroundings that led to his incarceration. So I started looking at the built environment. In particular, I started looking at the policies that shaped his world. And I'll save the history lesson, but he was in areas that were redlined. Him and Mom were in areas that were redlined, where the Homeowners Loan Corporation drew red lines around people's neighborhood or Black majority neighborhoods, deeming them too hazardous for some of the New Deal investments that were going on at the time. Highway construction barreled through their neighborhoods, displacing them. That's how my mom ended up in Wilkinsburg, actually. Urban renewal, they both faced the unfulfilled promises of urban renewal. Predatory lending, they were surrounded by contract leasing schemes and rent-to-own schemes. and they couldn't necessarily leave their communities. There were racial restrictive housing covenants all around them. And so I wanted to study the impact of those policies in today's context. So I started looking at home values and home prices. Now here's a chart that looks at the median home value list price of homes in neighborhoods with and looking at the share of the Black population in each. And as you can see on that x-axis, that's the percentage or share of the Black population in a zip code. On the y-axis is indicated by the prices on top of the bars. That's the average list price, and we did it for both Zillow and census data. And as you can see, homes in Black neighborhoods or homes in neighborhoods where the share of the Black population is less than 1%, on average, they're priced about $340,000. And they're about half as much in areas where the share of the Black population is 50% or higher. Now, a lot of people will say that's because of education, that's because of crime. But those are things you can look for in a study and control for in a study. And that's what we did. We took the absolute price and we controlled for structural characteristics. So we looked at square footage, size, number of rooms, all the physical characteristics, because we wanted to compare, get an apples to apples comparison between homes. But then we controlled for neighborhood amenities, things like education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics. So we could get a sense of how much a home is worth in a Black neighborhood and in a comparable home in a similar situations in a white neighborhood. And what we found pretty much astounds that homes in Black neighborhoods are underpriced by 23%, about $48,000 per home. Cumulatively, that's about $156 billion in lost equity. And this is occurring all over the country. Wherever you see a magenta circle, that's where the valuation is occurring. Wherever you see a green circle, that's where homes in Black neighborhoods are priced higher. Wherever you don't see circles, it's largely because there's not enough of a Black population to do the analysis. But as you can see, there are places that are green, but most overall, there's devaluation occurring all over the United States. Just to give you some sense, Richmond, there's a 17% difference, about $30,000 per home. And it ranges wildly by metro area. Lynchburg, Virginia, 81% difference, meaning if you could theoretically helicopter a home in a Black neighborhood and place the home in a white neighborhood with similar social circumstances, it would increase in value by 81%. Rochester, New York, 65%. Jacksonville, 47%. Detroit, 37% difference. Again, there are places where the homes in Black neighborhoods are priced higher on average. Nashville, for instance, plus 10%. Wichita Falls, plus 16%. Boston, plus 23%. Now, I always say Boston is no less racist than Lynchburg, but the home prices are higher. But I always put this $156 billion in perspective, just so people can get a sense of how much $156 billion is. $156 billion would have financed more than 4 million Black-owned businesses based upon the average amount Black people use to start their firms. It would have paid for more than 8 million four-year degrees based upon the average amount of a four-year diploma at a public institution. It would have replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan 3,000 times over. It would have covered mostly all of Hurricane Katrina damage, and it's doubled the annual economic burden of the opioid crisis. It's a big number, but I put that last bullet there because what is clear, if my father lived in a white neighborhood or a neighborhood where the home values were at a market rate, his municipality would have had better schools and greater resources, because we know that schools are financed through the taxes assessed on the value of homes. He would have had better infrastructure, better policing. He would have had greater opportunity to start a business, go to college. His life, my life would have been different. That's why I say that there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. That when things go wrong in Black communities, we blame Black people. And we don't look at the underwriting policies that extracted wealth and opportunities from Black people and Black residents in Black neighborhoods. I'm going to just share a clip with you of an exchange that I had with Representative Al Green of Texas. I got to testify a few years ago with members of the appraisal industry regarding the value of homes. Now, he asked us a basic question: do we believe that there's racism in appraising? Now, just to give you an update, you may have read the recent report that came out maybe 2 weeks ago that Freddie Mac showed that there is racial bias in appraising. Now, that report was specifically on appraisers. My study is more on the value of homes overall. That includes other actors in the market, including lenders, real estate agents, and other factors. But clearly, appraisers have something to do with this. But again, this is 2 years ago, before all these high-profile reports of Black people getting white stand-ins and then getting, or when their home is being appraised and getting hundreds of thousands of dollars more. But listen to this exchange, again, about 2 years ago.
If you think Black people are being discriminated when their property is being appraised, would you kindly raise your hand? One person on the panel. If you think that, for fear that I'm not communicating well, if you think that Black people are not being discriminated against when their property is being appraised, if you think they're not being discriminated against, kindly raise your hand. Okay, hands now. We're getting some consternation, I see.
Okay, now this is the thing reason why I want to show this is because there will always be people who will deny racism exists. This is not about shaming. This is not about trying to point the finger. The reality is that there are policies and practices in place that extract wealth from Black people, Black neighborhoods. This is a fact. And we have got to recognize facts. I mean, and this is what's hard in this work. If you're not going to deny, if you're going to deny, basic like data, science, things like that, we're going to be robbing ourselves and others of an opportunity to achieve the American dream. I'm going to show you the consequences of this and how, if we could get some equity, how this would benefit everyone. But first, I want to transition to business, because most people use the equity in their homes to finance their businesses. So if you have less equity, you have less business. And this is what shows up in the data. Black people represent about 14% of the population, but only 2% of the nation's employer businesses, firms with more than one employee. Only 1% of Black business owners were able to attain a loan in their founding year, compared to 7% of white entrepreneurs. Black entrepreneurs are denied bank loans more than twice as often as their white peers. And when we do get loans, we pay higher interest rates. About half of Black businesses survived the Great Recession, compared to 60% of white-owned firms. And so we haven't gotten all the data because the pandemic still is upon us, but we know that Black businesses were largely shut out of the PPP loan in initial tranche because they did not cover sole proprietorships. And so 95% of Black-owned businesses were sole proprietorships, so many didn't qualify. And by the time the policy changed, it was too late. Many businesses had to shutter. So we'll see what the percentage of Black businesses that survive in the upcoming months. But a lot of people will say the reason why Black businesses don't, or there's fewer Black businesses, is because of the quality. And so we wanted to look at that. And so we did, just like with housing, we wanted to examine business quality. And so we got business revenue from Dun & Bradstreet. We also got the race of the owner. But then we scraped all the Yelp data from businesses all across the country just to get a sense of quality as indicated by Yelp. And Yelp is widely regarded as a great consumer rating tool that and ratings on those tools generally predict for business quality. So if you are scoring high on Yelp, it means that you have good management skills overall. But then we control for neighborhood conditions, education, spending power, income, all these different things. Again, we wanted to get an apples to apples comparison between businesses. And what we found is that Black, Brown, and Asian-owned businesses are actually rated higher, it's not significant, but they're rated higher on average than their white-owned counterparts. But as businesses are cited in Blacker neighborhoods, they get fewer stars. I'll explain. So see that magenta line? That's Black, Brown, and Asian-owned businesses. See that gray line? That's white businesses. Again, this x-axis is the share of the Black population in a zip code. And as you can see, Black, Brown, and Asian businesses score higher on Yelp, but as the neighborhoods get Blacker, the ratings go down, showing the perception of the neighborhood on goods and businesses. In fact, highly rated businesses are really dinged by the negative perception, and it's costing highly rated businesses upwards of $4 billion as a result. Now, there's a saying that my elders, or I used to hear my elders say in my neighborhood. They would say our ice is just as cold. Our ice is just as cold. Now, meaning that, well, they knew that if you don't frequent quality in the hood, you are not driving revenue into the neighborhood, creating the kind of development you need. In addition, you're forcing high quality businesses to then compete with low quality businesses, distorting a market in a negative way. So things you don't want. So our elders were right. Our ice is just as cold, and we should be seeing investment. Now, there's ways to counter devaluation. We have to invest in people. We have to direct capital towards Black, Brown, and Asian homeowners and potential business owners, and so that they can actually have a chance at succeeding. There's a lack of investment because of devaluation. Now, the problem is a lot of people will say, let's invest in place. If you invest in place and not people, you will essentially raise property values and people will ultimately be pushed out. So you got to invest in people. And again, we must remove the unnecessary bureaucratic barriers to entry into entrepreneurship and home ownership. One of the revelations about the Yelp study is that Black business owners don't need any kind of financial literacy or accounting courses any more than white business owners. But oftentimes we make Black business owners to get a grant or a loan go through unnecessary hoops. We should invest in places because of devaluation. You have less resources in communities. And so we do need to make targeted infrastructure investments. We do need to create incentives to putting businesses in Black neighborhoods. But we must divest from racism. We got to remove policies that extract wealth. Just an example on the home value side regarding appraisals, we know that the price comparison model where you compare a home within a neighborhood is fraught, because if you compare one home's value to another in a neighborhood that's been discriminated against, you essentially just recycle the discrimination over and over again. And so things like that have to change. And by the way, those kind of practices are vestige of a segregated past that we got to change from, move on from. And then we need to install anti-racist policies that encourage inclusion. Now, I'm going to just show you what would happen if we invested in the underappreciated assets. in our communities. These assets that deserve investment but aren't getting it because of policy, practice, and negative perception. Again, Black people represent about 14% of the population, but only 2% of the nation's employer businesses. If Black businesses were the equivalent of the Black population, there would be more than 800,000 more Black businesses across the country, adding trillions of dollars to the economy. So every time we don't invest in the underappreciated assets, we cut ourselves off from enjoying or reaping those benefits. Now, I'm gonna end my presentation there because I want to get into a conversation with Dr. Ward, but I put all that out there is because we have an opportunity to do something in the next few years that we have not done in previous administrations throughout history, and that's invest in talent based upon skill, merit, democracy. We have in the past created policies that have tilted the scales on who deserves public good. So for me, not only should we remove the drags of racism from our markets, we need to restore the value that's been extracted by racism. So with that, I'm going to start the conversation, I guess, with Dr. Ward. And
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you once again, Dr. Perry, for your powerful presentation, for the work that you do. As a reminder to our folks on the call, Andre will be joining us on campus for the Graduate College Distinguished Lecture on Thursday, October 21st, and registration information will be sent to you after the webinar completes. So we hope to see you there. So Dr. Perry, let's get into the discussion. Let me just start by saying, first, I'm a teacher. So I'm like sitting here, I have your reports, I have your book, I'm just inundated. And there are so many quotable moments, arguments, or what I like to say, gems that you drop throughout this book that really left me inspired. And it really felt like a call to action, speaking directly to researchers, particularly those of us in the social sciences, right? So you say things like, there's nothing dispassionate about research, to I look towards fixing systems, not people, right? So there's moments throughout this book that feel and are really reminiscent of what I often like to talk about with my students, which is the legacy of Black radical consciousness found in urban studies from folks like W.E.B. Du Bois, Robert Staples, John Hope Franklin, Cedric Robinson, etc. Talk a little bit about your writing process and how intentional you were with respect to weaving together your personal experiences growing up in Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania, a majority Black city, to evolving into the scholar that you are today and your expert analysis of the socio-historical phenomena that really created the conditions for Black community resistance and survival.
Well, I work at a think tank that in many respects, it is, technically it's voted the #1 think tank in the world. And our research certainly influences policy throughout history. And so many of the policies that were harmful to Black people, we also have to acknowledge maybe our research carries some of the same biases as some of the policies that were enacted. In fact, we should assume that it did. So one of the goals of the book was to show that our position in society impacts how we research. I remember learning regression analysis in grad school, and we did a simple exercise of looking at academic achievement rates by race, and we controlled for a number of variables. But the reference group that was used in that initial analysis were was white men. And that really didn't make any sense to me then, because one, I remember going through the exercise of, to have the most stable regressions, you need the referent group to be the most populous. And so that would have been white women. But it set but more importantly, it set sort of a bad standard but followed a pretty predictable template of comparing Black people to white people in ways that are in apples to oranges comparison. I mean, when you talk about white people in the society and the educational policies that have been that deny Black people opportunities through most of history, to compare in that way is not framing the problem correctly. And oftentimes you don't have to compare racial groups against each other. I mean, and so, but it's that perspective that in order for there to be justice, Black people need to catch up to white people. That's problematic. In addition, one of the reasons why I've always put my background up front, because our background matters. And even now as a privileged researcher, I need to put my privilege up front as well. We are not dispassionate, disconnected observers of the world. We're part of it. Our institutions are part of the world. It's connected. And so we got to understand that. And so I'll use my data. The 23% difference in price in homes is almost, the price point is at a place where people are seeing, it's almost as if people are seeing twice as much crime than there actually is. They see worse education than there actually is. So that dim view is not just held by appraisers, lenders, and remember the real estate agent, it's held by society in general. And so for me, it's about dismantling the policies that inhibit the dim view, not just policy, public policies, but the policies that is in our research as well. So, yeah.
Right. And I think, oftentimes we know that data, interpreting data, you have to have a frame, you have to have concepts, and you have to have theories to help make sense and interpret the numbers that are in front of you. The interpretation doesn't emerge in a vacuum. And I think in the book, you really invite readers to reimagine the frames that we have been taught and that continue to inform, this larger societal discourse around race, difference, and inequality. And I think one of the frames that you talk about right at the outset of the book, it really has been propagated by culture of poverty theories, right? And through the storytelling piece throughout the book, you argue that these theories and the research questions, I'm going to keep kind of going back to that, the piece about the subjectivity inherent in the design of research questions, right? That the research questions themselves have always focused on how Black folks aren't living up to white norms, and that researchers really need to probe solutions to dismantling systems of racial privilege, anti-Black racism, instead of focusing our efforts exclusively on deconstructing social problems, especially in ways that sort of, perpetuate these white social norms. So, you just mentioned whites as the referent group, white men as the referent group, right? And the sort of issues and problems with that. Why is it so important for researchers to begin to ask better questions and be more reflexive about the questions that we ask, especially if the imperative is to move towards solutions-based or use-inspired research?
Well, the research we conduct influences policies and students every single day. One of the first policies I learned about, as many of you if you're of a certain age, is the Moynihan Report. And I remember reading the Moynihan Report, and it went against everything I knew about life. For those who don't know about the Moynihan Report, Patrick Moynihan, who was considered at the time a liberal lion. I mean, at the time he was the undersecretary, I think, of HUD. I can't remember, but he eventually, he was a longstanding elected official from the state of New York. Great, he was a liberal lion. But in his report, he essentially blamed Black women for poverty in this country. I mean, he sidestepped everything from slavery to Jim Crow racism, New Deal policies, all these different things, the employment discrimination, and basically
patriarchy, sexism,
sexism, all these different things, and said because families are headed by women households, they are inherently putting kids in harm's way. And it was like, whoa. I mean, so one, Patrick Moynihan was talking about me, and he was talking about my mother, who literally did everything to take me out of harm's way. So, and it showed you, one, that he had really no Black people in his research circle. This policy that was influential. I mean, it's still to this day, researchers still try to remix the Moynihan Report. I mean, over and over again. I mean, it's amazing, but it just showed you how if you see Black people in a dim light, your question from the outset will be flawed. So he went into it assuming that, you know what, if you're not in a nuclear family, you're problematic. And not even if you take that perspective, not even asking how families are constructed in the United States have a deep policy connection to it. And so it was just an example of what happens every day with researchers. If we don't know how to center someone other than our own experience, then we're going to produce very flawed research that can have very negative consequences.
Okay. So I'm going to ask a bit of since we're talking about reframing, right? I think the central thrust of the book is that it highlights the assets in Black communities, right? And you make this point that issues around equality, voting rights, equal access to quality health care, wealth distribution, that these are all, they're much more than social debates, that these are fundamental moral and ethical issues that are really reflective of the health and well-being of our democracy, right? And so these are issues that are politicized, and they have been framed as personal choice issues, right? Like communities, individuals are making bad choices. And there's a point that you make where you question the notion of choice, and you bring in data from the American Values Survey, and you show that the majority of white Americans, men and women, rank racial inequality and LGBTQ issues as the least important issues, right? So I think this data has some interesting implications, right? Suggesting that white Americans often undervalue these issues. Again, these are not about just the social nature, but the value inherent. So there's an undervaluing of these issues. And when you combine that with the choices that white politicians make and have historically made in supporting policies that negatively impact communities of color, do you think that researchers should begin to reframe our research questions to consider the value deficits that exist within white communities in this country?
Oh, let me tell you, the biggest deficit I've seen, I've worked in education all my life, and I used to joke, I said, there is an academic achievement gap, and it revolves around our knowledge and and education around history in this country. I mean, if you, I mean, there, in so many surveys, and I included one in my study, whites simply deprioritize race and racism in this country. They say it is not an issue, and they are taught that. I mean, we are taught that. It's just that my lived experiences tell me otherwise. I mean, literally, the ignoring slavery, Jim Crow racism, redlining. I mean, if you ignore that, I don't know how you can study or be a professor at teaching housing, political science. I mean, these are fundamental things that have happened in our country that we literally whitewash, and that ignorance, if you will, has implications in how we look at the world. I mean, we are literally, and I mean, today there is this asinine debate around critical race theory. I mean, that makes absolutely no sense. I mean, one, it for the most part, it was an obscure theory out of hundreds of theories that examine the impact of structural inequality from a legal perspective. And certainly many people have learned from it, but there's so many different frameworks for understanding racial inequality. It was almost like they cherry picked that one and said, oh, we're going to attack it. And it was so, unless you're in law school, and then even that, you have to be in a specific, you have to have a specific professor that made it a point, or if you, and there's, here and there, you have people taking it on in different disciplines. But it's relatively an obscure thing. But but so many individuals wanted the equivalent of white supremacy. They wanted to say, "Oh, here's the equivalent of what you're accusing us of," and it's silly. It is absolutely silly. So for me, that so much of that is about how we are taught and not wanting to confront basic facts, basic things. And so, and that's why, again, I showed that one video where people would say, there's no bias, there's no racism and I mean, so this, a few weeks ago, Freddie Mac put out that research that more or less confirmed what we were talking about. And it's like study after study after study after study, and people will go, no, that can't, no. And it's, this denial is from ignorance. I mean, so for me, it is not a matter of saber rattling and showing who's the best. It's about getting to truth. And are we into pursuing truth? And a lot of people just are not built to pursue truth. They're built to advance an ideology, belief system. And I find it that we always have to stretch ourselves, including me. I have to stretch myself in areas that I'm not familiar with to learn so I can improve.
Right. So we have a question in the chat, and I want to tie this question to something that comes up in a solution that you argue in the book. And the question is, what can we do to help fix problems and close these gaps if we're not planning to go into research? And one of the solutions that you identify in the book to upending racial wealth disparities is reparations, right? And your presentation, you revealed $156 billion in massive financial deficit linked to the inability for Black Americans to build wealth over time, right? And so you've written extensively about reparations and as a solution to addressing these structural forces. Where along with this, where should folks begin to educate themselves about this topic? And then going back to the question in the chat, this particular solution, are there others in helping to close some of these gaps?
You know, when it comes to reparations, I say this, most people believe in reparations, most people. They just don't believe in reparations for Black people. Remember, we've done this before. Reparations were given to Jews who, because of the Holocaust, so we have international examples. I mean, although they were not sufficient, and although many Native Americans feel that it was a token given the horrific genocide that took place, but there was some form of reparations for Native Americans, Japanese who've interned, even to a certain extent, 9/11 victims receive reparations. I mean, and you can argue that the PPP loan was an example of it, where businesses were shut down because we asked them to shut down, and the government had to make them whole. So, but when it comes to Black Americans not getting paid, I mean, let's be clear, Black people did not get paid during slavery. We were denied opportunities to build wealth during Jim Crow, shut out much of the New Deal, criminal justice system. I mean, and I have to always remind people that it was legal to discriminate against Black people for most of its history.
Including the affirmative action. Affirmative action as a policy did not directly benefit African Americans at the same rate that it benefited other groups, right? And
this is one of the reasons, I mean, several reasons why the Black wealth divide is, Black-white wealth divide is 170,000 more or less, 2016 data, to 17 for Black median wealth, 10 times the amount for white families. That didn't happen because of more know-how, better saving, bootstrapping. It occurred because of policy enabled some people to build wealth and denied others. And that is it. But that denial from building wealth also came with narrative that said we didn't deserve it, we didn't earn it, we didn't do all that, and much of those beliefs are with us today. So not only must we restore the value at some point, because there's no way to close that gap, that wealth gap, without some form of capital. And so we need to deliver on that unpaid invoice from 1865, saying, hey, we didn't get our reparations then. We were denied the New Deal policies. I mean, and we have records of this. This is not like, you know, you hear people say, oh, I didn't own any slaves. Well, we're not asking you to pay. We're asking the federal government that made this happen. And so, and then particularly when it comes to spending, we've seen over the last year and a half what the Treasury can actually do when it comes to these things. So, and the sky didn't fall, you know, we're not in some perilous place. Actually, we're probably better off. And as we move out of this pandemic and markets start to stabilize, we're probably going to come out stronger. But the reality is that reparations should be a moral imperative. I mean, I can't think of saying, hey, we denied you all of these opportunities, and me saying, oh, but that's unfair. I just, the logic needs to change on that.
Right. So we have another question in the chat, and this is related to the 1968 report of the Kerner Commission. And, you know, in the chat, Deborah argues that it seemed like they really addressed the issues that you and your work are dedicated to. What are your thoughts about the Kerner Commission report, and what is still needed to address racial inequities in all systems today? Do you think it's a good starting point for discussion?
Oh, we need another Kerner report. I mean, I think the issue is we didn't really build upon it because it also came at a very tumultuous time where you had, remember it was 68, and a few years later, the backlash from affirmative action to much of the war on poverty really put the brakes on many of the things that the Kerner Commission explicated. And so we do need a new paradigm for community and economic development. And one of the things I strongly encourage is investments in housing, in business, and in infrastructure. Because in infrastructure, I do mean infrastructure, and I actually think much of the Biden's policies around infrastructure are good policies, because I can't think of another way to put hammer in hand of undereducated individuals and put them into the middle class. It almost requires some form of infrastructure. And that goes not just for Black people, that's everybody. I mean, if you're in Arizona, you're working class, your chances of living a middle class lifestyle, I mean, is dwindling. And so we really do need some type of infrastructure program so that we can, because what we're then doing is assuring that the adults with children who get these federal jobs are going to have a much greater likelihood of going to college, but getting in the knowledge economy. But for those who are 40 plus, 50 plus, you know, looking to make, you know, $50,000, $60,000, it's going to have to come through some form of infrastructure bill, because, you know, between automation, the future of work, you know, those other types of jobs people talk about are just disappearing.
So we have one more question in the chat, and this is around research questions. And the question is, are there dangers we need to be cognizant of or vigilant about if we start reframing our research questions before we go looking for data? How much should the data we discover cause us to reframe our research questions? And I'm going to put the caveat for those of us and you on the call who teach research methods classes, and you engage in conversations about epistemology and ontology. We understand that the genesis of all research begins with curiosity and inquiry. And in that phase of curiosity and inquiry, we are always internally framing questions in our mind that then manifest into the questions and or hypotheses that are the starting point for all research. So that is the phase that researchers, I think, really need to get clear about their own biases, social location, and how that impacts the way that they are framing their initial question.
Yeah, you know, and that's why, and we talked a little bit about this earlier on, you can't separate yourself from your research. It's impossible. But we act as if we can. And so if you know, and this is the thing, it's impossible to know our unconsciousness, but you know if you are short when it comes to women's issues. You know if you're short when it comes to sexuality issues. You can look at your writing, your track record, to see what have you done. Do they have a clear eye view, or show it to another professor? Say, you know, you haven't written on this, even though this race thing, this sexuality thing, this gender thing is a lot of what we do in America. It's impossible to talk about the economy without talking about women. It's impossible to talk about anything without gender issues involved. Like, and so if you haven't done that, you really need to check yourself. And if you're going to check yourself, and that's why I say, put them up front, put your biases up front. And then, and I also believe this, if you are in a academic community that is nurturing, you will have conversations that may be challenging, but they will be had, you know.
That's right.
And so, you know, I say all the time, develop the kind of relationship with your colleagues where you can say, you know what, maybe I should look at this another way, because of my history, because of my biases, because of my previous work. And it's okay. Trust me, as a person of color, I got asked to shift my research a 1,000 ways. It did not kill me to try different approaches.
So I'm going to ask you in our last 2 minutes, one final question. And this is because this is probably, obviously, for all the obvious reasons, my favorite chapter in the book. For the sake of America, elect a Black woman president. And in that chapter, you talk about the activism within contemporary electoral politics in Black majority cities like Atlanta, right? And so, you know, you're talking about the election of Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, you know, Stacey Abrams as a critical figure in the voting rights movement. And it had me thinking about other Black women and organizations like the Black to the Future Fund, Kimberly Crenshaw's African American Policy Forum, right? How do you see this work that Black women are leading in advancing representation in electoral politics? How do you see this work growing through the Biden administration, given where you're positioned in DC? How do you see this work advancing, and what is the role of research in advancing these political efforts?
Well, it is clear that Black women really carried Biden's water in many states. When you talk about Georgia in particular, the Get Out the Vote campaign, largely Black women led organizations, but it wasn't just Georgia. You're talking about that special election when Doug Jones won. That was Black women on the ground doing that work. When you talk about the Black women mayors, that one time it was 3 Black women mayors in Louisiana, Black Get Out the Vote people did it. But when you look at the Democratic Party and who they invested in, they always go to Black women at the last minute. And it's a reflection of how we, in conservative, Democrats, Republicans, whatever, there's a devaluing of Black women. And this is why I wanted to, one of the reasons why I wanted to write this chapter is because if we if we continue to not disaggregate these issues and recognize the assets in our communities, we're doing people a disservice. I think the Democratic Party in general, I mean, there's some good things, but in general, the Democratic Party has done what everybody has done, and that's devalue Black women. And so for me, you know, when it comes to politics, and so for me, I feel it's incumbent upon me in all areas to uplift the assets, the people, the organizations that are really doing good work, and deserving of investment. And you can't, and good meaning, and this is something that we need to be clear about, morality matters, democracy matters. We can't continue to deny these things. And so when I see people doing good, and I mean that good work, we have got to uplift their efforts.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the powerful presentation. There's a big shout out in the Q&A to those pillows behind you and all that they represent and reflect Thank you to everyone who joined us this afternoon. Again, a reminder, please join the Graduate College for its distinguished lecture with Dr. Andre Perry on Thursday, October 21st, where he will be here live in the flesh in Arizona. Have a good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Perry.